In the depths of loneliness, she found hope in the most unexpected promise. "In my cabin, you'll be blessed between my sheets," the cowboy told her, words that echoed through her emptiness like thunder across the plains. For a woman who'd given up on miracles, his confidence offered something she hadn't felt in years: possibility. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Dust danced across the wide Oklahoma plains, swirling in golden eddies that caught the late afternoon sun. John Smith tipped his battered hat, revealing eyes that held a gentleness seemingly at odds with his weathered face. Those eyes now met Mary Johnson's across the yard, communicating something wordless, yet profound. Years of harsh sun and private grief had hardened the cowboy's features, but couldn't dim the kindness that radiated from him. Mary stood beside her faded wooden cabin, one hand resting on a splintered fence post that seemed as tired as she felt. The structure behind her might have been called home, but it had never truly felt like one. 5 years she'd been here, and the silence still pressed in on her like a physical weight. Her heart ached from years of solitude, each day bleeding into the next, with nothing to mark their passing except the changing seasons and deepening lines around her eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am," John called, his voice carrying easily on the prairie wind. He approached slowly, respectfully, as if giving her ample time to send him away if she wished. Mary nodded in acknowledgement, her throat suddenly too dry for words. It had been weeks since she'd spoken to another soul. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles east, and they weren't the visiting kind. "Your fence could use some mending," he observed, gesturing to the sagging rails with a calloused hand. "Storm's coming in a few days. Might want to shore it up before then." She followed his gaze to the horizon, where no clouds yet gathered. "How can you tell?" The words felt rusty in her mouth. John tapped his nose with a small smile. "In riding these plains long enough to smell it coming." The wind gusted suddenly, sending Mary's skirts fluttering and lifting strands of hair from her face. She tucked them back automatically, suddenly conscious of her appearance in a way she hadn't been for months. John's voice was steady and low as he looked out over the vast emptiness surrounding them. "This land's harsh, but it don't have to break you." Mary's gaze faltered, dropping to the parched earth beneath her worn boots. The promise in his words stirred something she thought she'd buried deep, a foolish hope that life could be more than mere survival. That connection was still possible, even here, even for her. "What brings you this way, Mr. Smith?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "Just John," he corrected gently. "And sometimes a man just follows where his horse leads him." Her hands, rough from endless toil, clung to a splintered fence post as the Oklahoma wind whipped her skirts around her ankles. Mary Johnson surveyed the vast emptiness stretching before her, the prairie seemingly endless under the afternoon sun. The wooden cabin behind her stood silent, a shelter that had never truly become a home. Its weathered boards and sagging porch told the story of her 3 years alone in this unforgiving landscape. Inside those walls lived only the ghosts of dreams that never took root. Dreams of children's laughter, of a family gathered around a table, of purpose beyond mere survival. Each night, she'd lie awake listening to the wind's mournful howl, a sound that echoed the hollowness in her chest. She'd come west with such hope, fleeing the whispers and pitying glances back east after doctors confirmed what she'd long suspected. Barren, they'd called her, as if her worth as a woman could be reduced to a single cruel word. The homestead was supposed to be her fresh start, her chance to build something meaningful despite her body's betrayal. Instead, she'd found only silence and dust, days bleeding into one another with nothing to mark their passing but the changing seasons. The crunch of boots on dry earth pulled her from her thoughts. John Smith approached slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the ground. Mary's grip tightened on the fence post, her knuckles whitening. There was something about his presence that unsettled her, not with fear, but with a forgotten feeling she barely recognized. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady like the distant rumble of thunder. He removed his battered hat, revealing sun-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls. Mary nodded in acknowledgement, unable to find her voice. The cowboy stood respectfully distant, yet she felt drawn to him in a way that made her heart quicken. His weathered face held no judgment, only a quiet understanding that made her wonder what losses he carried beneath his composed exterior. "Storm's coming," John remarked, glancing at the horizon where clouds gathered. "Your roof looks like it might need some attention before it hits." Mary's cheeks flushed with unexpected warmth. Was it embarrassment at her neglected homestead, or something else entirely? For the first time in years, a flicker of something stirred in her chest, a dangerous, fragile hope she barely dared to name. She watched his hands, strong and capable, and wondered how it would feel to not face the coming storm alone. The Oklahoma sunset painted the sky in fierce strokes of crimson and gold, casting long shadows across the weathered porch where Mary Johnson stood. She watched as the cowboy approached, his silhouette dark against the dying light. The day's heat was finally breaking, giving way to the cool breath of evening that rustled through the tall grass surrounding her isolated cabin. John Smith extended a dented tin mug toward her, steam rising from the dark liquid inside. "Figured you might need this," he said, his voice carrying the gentle roughness of a man accustomed to long silences. The coffee smelled rich and bitter, promising warmth against the encroaching chill. Mary's fingers brushed against his as she accepted the offering. The mug's heat spread through her work-roughened hands, hands that had toiled endlessly, yet never cradled a child of her own. She wrapped her fingers around it gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her bones. "Name's John," he said simply, settling his tall frame beside her on the porch steps. His boots were caked with the red Oklahoma soil, testament to miles traveled across the unforgiving terrain. He didn't press for conversation, seeming comfortable with the quiet that hung between them. "Mary," she whispered back, her voice nearly lost in the evening breeze. The admission of her name felt strangely intimate after so many months of speaking to no one but herself and the occasional traveling salesman. She stared into the dark liquid, watching it ripple with her slight trembling. The shame of her barrenness pressed down on her like a physical weight. Out here on the prairie, a woman alone was already cause for whispers. A woman who couldn't bear children was something else entirely. Useless, some would say. The knowledge of her infertility had driven her husband away years ago, leaving her with nothing but this cabin and the endless expanse of sky. Yet when she dared to glance at the cowboy, his eyes held no judgment. They were kind eyes, weathered at the corners like the rest of him, but clear and steady. In his gaze, she saw something she hadn't encountered in years, understanding without pity. John sipped his coffee, looking out at the darkening prairie. "Beautiful land," he observed. "Harsh, but beautiful." Mary nodded, feeling something inside her chest loosen slightly. The cowboy's presence beside her was solid and reassuring, like the cabin walls that sheltered her from storms. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence that surrounded her didn't feel empty, it felt shared. "You ain't alone," John told her, as dusk deepened across the Oklahoma prairie. His words struck Mary Johnson like a physical touch, resonating in places she'd thought long numb. She clutched the dented tin mug tighter, its warmth a small comfort against the growing chill. Night gradually cloaked the landscape, transforming familiar shapes into mysterious silhouettes. Inside the cabin, a lantern cast flickering shadows against the thin wooden walls. The light danced across John's weathered face as he settled into the rickety chair opposite her. "Lost my wife and boy to fever 5 years back," he said, his voice steady but tinged with old pain. "Thought the grief would kill me too. Mary looked up, surprised by his candor. The cowboy wasn't one for many words, yet here he was, opening wounds she suspected few had seen. "What did you do?" she asked softly. John's eyes reflected the lantern light. "Rode, kept moving, worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana." His calloused fingers traced the rim of his mug. "Found that pain rides with you no matter how far you go." Outside, a coyote called into the darkness, its lonely cry echoing Mary's own isolation. "Eventually," he continued, "I learned to carry it differently. Not lighter, just differently." Mary nodded, understanding more than she could express. Her own grief, the children she'd never bear, the family she'd never have, had been her silent companion for years. John spoke of trails he'd ridden through mountains where eagles soared overhead, of sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. He told her about an old Mexican vaquero who'd taught him to break horses with patience instead of force, and of a widow in Kansas who'd fed him when he had nothing. "Everyone's got their burdens," he said. "Sharing 'em makes the load easier." The lantern flickered as a draft swept through the cabin. Mary pulled her shawl tighter, but the chill she felt came from within, from walls breaking down that she'd built years ago. "I thought being alone was safer," she admitted, the words barely audible. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Safer, maybe, but no way to live." As the night deepened around them, Mary's guard softened with each story John shared. His resilience in the face of crushing loss offered something she'd abandoned long ago: hope. Not the naive hope of youth, but something weathered and real. For the first time in years, Mary dared to imagine peace might be possible, even in broken places. Perhaps especially there. "This cabin's seen worse than loneliness," John Smith admitted as thunder rolled across the Oklahoma prairie. His weathered fingers traced a crack in the wooden table, eyes reflecting memories Mary couldn't see. "Had a family here once, lost 'em to fever 3 winters back." Mary Johnson's throat tightened. She'd assumed his kindness came from pity, not understanding. The thunder growled closer, and rain began to patter against the roof of her modest home. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate against such loss. "Ain't looking for sorry," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Just sayin' pain's got company in these parts." Mary studied his face in the flickering lantern light, wondering if this cowboy truly saw beyond her surface. Could he sense the emptiness she carried? The shame of a woman unable to create life in a land that demanded renewal? Or was his presence merely temporary relief, a kindness that would vanish with the storm? "Storm's gonna last the night," John observed, rising from the table. "Best get some rest. Morning comes early out here." Sleep eluded Mary as rain lashed against her cabin walls. The knowledge that John slept in the barn nearby both comforted and unsettled her. His presence had disturbed the careful loneliness she'd constructed around herself like a fence. Morning arrived with brilliant clarity, the storm having washed the world clean. Mary stepped onto her porch, coffee mug warming her palms, and froze. John had already begun the day's work, his shirt discarded as he split logs with powerful practice swings. Sweat gleamed on his back, muscles moving beneath sun-browned skin as the axe rose and fell. Mary felt heat rise to her cheeks, ashamed of how her eyes lingered, yet unable to look away. This wasn't just appreciation of strength. It was hunger for connection, for touch, for something she'd denied herself for too long. The cowboy paused, sensing her presence. He turned, offering a simple nod instead of embarrassment at being observed. "Morning," he called, driving the axe into a stump and wiping his brow with a forearm. Mary clutched her mug tighter, suddenly aware of her faded dress and hair hastily tied back. She'd stopped caring how she appeared to others years ago. Now, unexpectedly, it mattered. "Need some help?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she set down the mug and stepped toward him. The question meant more than just splitting wood. It was an offering, a tentative step towards something neither had named. John Smith grinned, and handed her the axe, their hands brushing against each other. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through Mary's body, awakening nerves long dormant. She gripped the wooden handle, feeling its weight and the subtle impression of his palm, still warm against the surface. "Swing hard, Mary," he encouraged, his voice carrying that quiet confidence that seemed as natural to him as breathing. "Let your shoulders do the work, not just your arms." She positioned herself in front of the log, hesitating briefly before raising the axe above her head. With a determined exhale, she brought it down, the blade biting into the wood with a satisfying thunk. It didn't split completely, but John nodded approvingly. "That's it. Again," he said, standing back to give her space. Mary felt something stir within her chest as she worked, a sense of capability, of strength she'd forgotten she possessed. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, tethered to something real, instead of merely existing in the shadow of her disappointments. They spent the afternoon working side by side, mending the splintered fence posts that marked the boundary of her small property. John showed her how to stretch the wire tight enough to keep predators out, while Mary held the posts steady. Their rhythm became natural, unspoken, as if they'd been working together for years rather than days. "You're a quick study," he remarked as they finished a particularly challenging section. "Most folks take longer to get the hang of it." Mary felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "I've had practice being self-sufficient," she replied, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Later, they tended to the horses, brushing their coats until they gleamed in the late afternoon sun. The animals responded to John's touch with immediate trust, and Mary found herself watching his hands, strong yet gentle, as they moved across the mare's flank. "They know good people," he said, noticing her observation. "Animals have a sense about these things." His laughter came unexpectedly when one of the horses nudged him playfully, nearly knocking him off balance. The sound filled the barnyard, rich and genuine, cascading through the silence that had once suffocated Mary's days. She found herself joining in, her own laugh, rusty but real. As dusk approached, they sat on the porch steps, sharing water from the dented tin mug. The simple work had transformed the day into something meaningful, the cabin no longer feeling like a monument to her solitude, but a place where new possibilities might take root. "Thank you," Mary said softly, "for showing me how to swing an axe." John's eyes met hers, understanding that she meant far more than just the day's lessons. "You're stronger than you know," John Smith told her one evening, his hand lingering on her shoulder. The warmth of his calloused fingers seeped through the thin fabric of Mary's dress, sending a flutter through her chest that both frightened and thrilled her. Mary's breath caught, the ache of her barrenness still present but somehow soothed by his words. "How can you be so sure?" she whispered, not daring to meet his gaze. The cowboy squeezed her shoulder gently before letting his hand fall away. "I've watched you," he said simply, "seen how you face each day despite everything." Mary Johnson turned away, blinking back unexpected tears. Could she truly believe in a future again? The thought terrified her. Hope had been a cruel companion in the past, promising much but delivering only disappointment. Yet something in John's steady presence made her wonder if perhaps this time could be different. Outside, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, bringing with them the promise of a storm. By nightfall, rain lashed against the cabin's windows with vengeful force. Lightning split the Oklahoma sky in jagged bursts, illuminating the small room in harsh white flashes. Thunder followed, so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the modest structure. Mary paced anxiously, jumping at each thunderclap. The storms out here on the prairie were different, wilder, more threatening than anything she'd known before. Each gust of wind that howled through the cracks in the walls sent her heart racing anew. "Ain't nothing to fear from a bit of rain," John said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. The homesteader glanced over to where he sat by the fire, seemingly unbothered by nature's fury. His hands moved methodically over a piece of wood, knife carving away small curls that fell to the floor. The lantern light caught the angles of his face, shadows dancing across features that had become increasingly dear to her. "What are you making?" she asked, desperate for distraction. He smiled without looking up. "Not sure yet. Sometimes you just have to start and see what the wood wants to be." Another crash of thunder made Mary flinch. John patted the spot beside him on the bench. "Come sit. Storm can't hurt you in here." Hesitantly, she crossed the room and lowered herself beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The rhythmic scrape of his knife against wood gradually calmed her nerves, even as the tempest raged outside. In this moment of shared silence, Mary realized something had shifted between them, something as subtle yet profound as the changing seasons. The storm raged with unrelenting fury, rattling the thin wooden walls of Mary Johnson's cabin. Rain pounded against the windows like angry fists demanding entry, while lightning slashed across the darkened sky, briefly illuminating the sparse interior. Mary paced nervously, her fingers twisting together as each thunderclap made her flinch. "Ain't nothing to fear," John Smith said, his voice a steady anchor amid the chaos. He sat calmly by the fireplace, the dancing flames casting shadows across his weathered face as he carefully whittled a piece of pine wood. His hands moved with practiced precision, seemingly unbothered by the tempest outside. Mary watched him, drawing strength from his composure. The cowboy's certainty was something she'd never possessed, a belief that the world, for all its fury, would right itself eventually. She hesitated, then crossed the room and lowered herself beside him on the rough-hewn bench. Their knees touched, a small point of warmth that neither acknowledged nor moved away from. The lantern light flickered as wind howled through the cabin's cracks. Mary's gaze drifted to the wooden figurine taking shape beneath John's knife. Something with 4 legs, perhaps a horse. "My pa taught me," he explained, noticing her interest. "Said idle hands invite trouble, especially during storms." She nodded, watching his fingers work the grain. "My father was afraid of storms, used to hide under blankets until they passed. And you?" "I count seconds between lightning and thunder," she admitted. "Like I could somehow predict when it'll end." John smiled, the rare expression transforming his sun-hardened features. They sat in companionable silence, the only sounds being the crackle of fire, the persistent drumming of rain, and the soft scrape of blade against wood. "Ever think of starting over?" he asked softly, his eyes still focused on his carving. The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Mary's heart quickened its pace. Was this merely conversation to pass the storm, or something more? An offering, perhaps? She began, then paused. "I came here to start over. Not sure I did it right." John nodded thoughtfully. Some things need more than just new soil. Need tending, patience. "Like what?" she whispered. "Like hope," he answered simply. "Like believing something good can grow where something painful once stood." Outside, the rain began to ease, the spaces between thunderclaps lengthening. Mary felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening, as if a tightly wound spring had been given room to breathe. The cowboy's steady presence beside her felt like possibility itself. "I think," she said carefully, "I might be ready to try again." John's hand stilled on his carving, and when he looked at her, Mary saw understanding in his eyes. The Oklahoma sun hung high in the cloudless sky as John Smith and Mary rode out across the prairie. They needed to check on the small herd of cattle grazing on the western edge of his property. Mary's mare, a gentle chestnut with a white blaze, matched stride with John's weathered stallion as they traversed the rolling landscape. "Been a while since I've ridden like this," Mary admitted, adjusting her grip on the worn leather reins. The sensation of freedom washed over her as the horse's powerful muscles carried her forward. Wind whipped through her hair, loosening strands from her practical braid until they streamed behind her like a banner. John glanced sideways, his usually stoic expression softening. "You're a natural," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her over the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the hard-packed earth. The vastness of the prairie stretched around them, endless blue sky meeting golden grass at a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. Mary inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with air that smelled of sun-warmed grass and wildflowers. For years, she had viewed this landscape as a prison of isolation. Now, with John beside her, she began to see it differently. They crested a gentle rise, and the small herd came into view below, 20 or so cattle grazing contentedly in a shallow valley where a seasonal stream provided water. John reined his horse to a stop, and Mary followed suit. "They look healthy," she observed, grateful for something practical to focus on, besides the warmth spreading through her chest whenever he looked at her. The cowboy nodded, removing his hat briefly to wipe his brow. "Been a good season so far." As they sat atop their mounts, surveying the cattle, Mary felt John's gaze shift to her. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between wonder and satisfaction. "You look like you belong here," he said quietly, a rare smile lifting the corners of his mouth. Mary's heart twisted at his words. Belonging. How long had she craved that feeling? How many nights had she lain awake in her empty cabin, convinced she would forever remain an outsider to happiness? "Do I?" she asked, her voice barely audible. John nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Like you and this land were made for each other." They urged their horses forward again, circling the herd at a comfortable trot. With each hoofbeat, Mary felt the loneliness that had defined her existence for so long begin to fade. The prairie no longer seemed to mock her isolation, but instead offered possibilities she'd never dared consider. For the first time in years, Mary Johnson allowed herself to believe that belonging somewhere, with someone, might actually be possible. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the Oklahoma sky in strokes of amber and purple. John Smith guided his horse toward the creek that cut through the eastern edge of the property, with Mary following close behind. The gentle burble of water over smooth stones offered a welcome respite from the day's work mending fences. "This spot's my favorite," John said, dismounting with practiced ease. He loosened the saddle on his horse, allowing the animal to graze freely on the lush grass that grew along the creek bank. Mary slid from her mount, her muscles aching pleasantly from the day's labor. The cowboy had shown her how to properly repair fence posts, his patience never wavering when her inexperienced hands fumbled with the tools. Now, watching him settle comfortably on a flat rock by the water, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. "You come here often?" she asked, lowering herself beside him. John nodded, reaching for a small pebble. "When things get too quiet in my head." He tossed the stone into the still water, and they both watched as ripples expanded outward in perfect circles. "Life's like that," he mused, his voice carrying on the evening breeze. "One choice changes everything." Mary's throat tightened as she considered his words. She'd chosen isolation after learning of her infertility, believing it the only way to avoid judgment and pity. The cabin had become both sanctuary and prison, a place where no one could see her failure as a woman. Yet sitting here with this quiet man, watching how the ripples from one small stone transformed the entire surface of the water, she wondered if she'd been wrong all along. "What choice brought you out here?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. The cowboy was silent for a long moment, his weathered fingers selecting another pebble. "Lost my wife and child to fever 5 years back," he finally said. "Couldn't bear staying where everything reminded me of them." Mary's eyes stung with unshed tears. Here was someone who understood loss, who carried it with dignity rather than shame. She watched as he skipped another stone across the water's surface, creating multiple rippling circles that intersected and changed one another. "Sometimes I think I chose wrong," she whispered, hiding away. John turned to her then, his gaze steady and warm in the fading light. "Ain't never too late to choose again." A gentle breeze stirred the tall grass around them as their horses grazed contentedly. For the first time in years, Mary felt the hard shell around her heart begin to crack, like ice breaking on a spring-warmed pond. John Smith's calloused hand found Mary's, both rough from labor, yet gentle in intention. The warmth of his touch traveled up her arm and settled somewhere deep in her chest, a sensation both foreign and familiar. The evening breeze whispered through the tall prairie grass surrounding them as they sat side by side on the weathered porch steps. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the chorus of crickets beginning their nightly serenade. His eyes, weathered at the corners from years squinting beneath the Oklahoma sun, held hers with an earnestness that made her breath catch. For once, Mary didn't pull away. The walls she'd built around her heart, brick by painful brick after learning of her infertility, seemed less impenetrable in his presence. She allowed her fingers to curl around his, a silent acknowledgement of his words. "I've been alone so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. The cowboy nodded, understanding etched in the lines of his face. Being alone and being lonely ain't the same thing. One's a choice, the other's a burden. They sat in comfortable silence until the first stars appeared, then made their way back to the cabin. Inside, Mary busied herself preparing a simple stew, chopping vegetables they harvested together that morning. The familiar rhythm of the knife against the cutting board steadied her racing thoughts. The aroma of simmering meat and herbs gradually filled the small space, transforming the once empty cabin into something that felt remarkably like home. John moved around her kitchen with surprising ease, finding bowls and spoons without asking, setting the rough-hewn table as if he'd done it 100 times before. He hummed softly as he worked, a melody Mary didn't recognize, but found soothing nonetheless. She stirred the pot, stealing glances at him as he placed a lantern at the center of the table, its warm glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. This domestic scene, so ordinary yet extraordinary in its simplicity, felt both utterly foreign and inexplicably right. For years, Mary had eaten her meals in silence, the emptiness of the cabin a constant reminder of all she lacked. Now, with John's presence filling the spaces between heartbeats, the silence had transformed into something peaceful rather than punishing. "Smells like heaven," he commented, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Mary smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "It's just stew." "No," he replied, his gaze holding hers. "It's more than that." And somehow, in that moment of shared understanding, they both knew he wasn't talking about the food at all. The stew simmered on the small iron stove, filling the cabin with a rich aroma that reminded Mary of simpler times. As she stirred the pot, her mind wandered to the empty spaces in her life, spaces she'd once hoped would be filled with children's laughter. John Smith sat at the rough-hewn table, whittling away at a piece of wood, his calloused fingers working with surprising gentleness. "Ever want kids?" she blurted out, then froze, regret thick in the air between them. The wooden spoon stilled in her hand as she stared down at the bubbling stew, wishing she could take back the words that had escaped without permission. The cowboy's knife paused mid-stroke. He set it down carefully, considering her question with the same deliberate attention he gave to everything. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs as silence stretched between them. She'd never spoken so directly about the pain that had defined her for so long. "Had a time when I thought that was the only way to leave something behind," John finally said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Lost my wife and unborn child years back. Tornado took our homestead." He looked up, meeting her eyes across the small cabin. "Figured that was the end of my chance at family." Mary's throat tightened. She'd suspected loss in his past, but hadn't known its shape until now. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate against such grief. John stood and crossed to the stove, taking the wooden spoon from her trembling hand. "Family ain't just blood, it's who you choose," he said, his answer slow and certain. "Learned that riding with men who became brothers to me. Some folks find their people later in life." Tears pricked Mary's eyes as his words settled into the hollow spaces of her heart. She wondered if she could choose him, if she could let go of the pain that had kept her heart locked tight for so long. The shame of her barrenness had been her constant companion, a shadow that followed her even to this remote cabin. "The good Lord gives different gifts," he continued, stirring the stew with steady strokes. "Some folks raise children, others tend the land, care for animals, or look after neighbors." His eyes, warm and sincere, found hers again. All ways of nurturing life. Mary's breath caught as his free hand reached for hers. "Work roughened skin against skin. There's more than one way to leave your mark, Mary Johnson," he said softly. She nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat, but feeling something shift inside her. A door long sealed, beginning, finally, to crack open. Silver moonlight cascaded through the cabin window, painting the wooden floorboards with ghostly patterns. John Smith sat on a three-legged stool, his weathered fingers coaxing a mournful melody from his guitar. The tune drifted through the small space, a haunting sound that seemed to give voice to all the unspoken yearnings that had filled these walls long before either of them had arrived. Mary Johnson emerged from the shadows, a woolen blanket draped around her shoulders against the evening chill. She moved silently, drawn to the music like a moth to flame. The cowboy nodded slightly as she settled beside him on the edge of the bed, acknowledging her presence without breaking the spell his playing had cast. "My father had a guitar like that," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle strumming. "He'd play on summer evenings after the work was done." John's hands stilled momentarily. "Was he any good?" "Better than me," Mary replied with a soft laugh, "though that's not saying much." He smiled and shifted the instrument toward her. "Want to try?" She shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter. The fabric was rough against her skin, but comforting in its weight. Outside, the Oklahoma wind whispered secrets to the prairie grass, a constant companion to their solitude. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she admitted, watching his fingers resume their dance across the strings. Each note seemed to loosen something tight within her chest. "Peaceful, like I belong somewhere." John played softer now, the melody shifting to something less sorrowful. His eyes remained fixed on his hands, but she could see the slight tension in his jaw, as if weighing his words carefully. "You make this place feel like home," she whispered, almost afraid to believe it herself. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile as morning mist. The music stopped. John set the guitar aside, the sudden silence deafening. His eyes, illuminated by moonlight, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then stay, Mary," he said, his voice low and steady as the earth beneath them. "Stay with me." 4 simple words that somehow contained everything: promise, hope, possibility. Mary felt tears prick behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensation of doors opening where she'd only seen walls. The lantern flame flickered, casting their shadows large against the cabin wall. 2 separate silhouettes that from certain angles appeared to merge into one. Outside, an owl called into the night, its lonely voice a reminder of what she'd been before he'd ridden into her life. Mary reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they found his calloused hand. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Mary Johnson's pulse thundered beneath her worn cotton blouse as she balanced precariously on the barn roof. The morning sun beat down on her back while she hammered nails into weathered shingles. Below her, John Smith handed up another plank, their movements falling into a perfect rhythm they'd developed over the past few weeks. "Watch that loose board," he called, his voice carrying on the prairie breeze. Mary nodded, shifting her weight carefully. The height made her dizzy, but she refused to show fear. This barn needed fixing, and she was determined to prove herself useful. "Hand me that hammer," she said, extending her arm. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. John's calloused hand lingered against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. "You're good at this," he remarked, a hint of admiration in his eyes. The compliment caught Mary off guard, and a laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, a genuine sound of joy she barely recognized as her own. "My father taught me," she replied, surprised by how easily the words came. She rarely spoke of her family. "Before I came west." John climbed up beside her, his movements sure and steady. Together, they worked through the afternoon, patching holes where rain had seeped through during the last storm. The cowboy showed her how to overlap the shingles properly, his patience never wavering when she made mistakes. "That should hold through winter," he said as they climbed down hours later. Mary's muscles ached pleasantly from the labor, a physical reminder that she was still alive, still capable. As dusk approached, a chill settled over the Oklahoma plains. Inside the cabin, John knelt before the fireplace, carefully arranging kindling beneath larger logs. Mary watched his strong hands work, how they could be both powerful enough to break a wild horse and gentle enough to coax flames from dying embers. "Cold night coming," he murmured, striking a match. The fire caught quickly, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Mary wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and settled into a chair nearby, mesmerized by the growing flames. Each word John spoke, each accidental touch throughout the day had chipped away at the walls she'd built around her heart. The fire crackled and popped as she lost herself in dangerous thoughts. What if she allowed herself to care for him? What if she told him about her barrenness, her greatest shame? What if he stayed anyway? The cowboy glanced over his shoulder, catching her staring. Instead of looking away, Mary held his gaze, her mind racing with possibilities she'd never dared consider before. The embers in the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls as Mary Johnson gathered her courage. Her question hung in the air between them, weighted with years of unspoken longing. "What do you want, John?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to show in years. John Smith turned from where he stood by the window, moonlight silhouetting his broad shoulders. His eyes found hers, intense and honest in a way that made her breath catch. "You, Mary. A life with you," he said simply, the words falling between them like stones in still water. The weight of her past pressed against his declaration. The shame of her barrenness, the years of isolation she'd chosen as protection against further heartbreak. All of it seemed to stand between them like an invisible wall. "I don't know if I remember how to share a life," she admitted, fingers twisting the rough fabric of her skirt. The cowboy crossed the small room with deliberate steps. "Then we'll learn together," he said, reaching for her hand. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, yet his touch remained gentle. Mary let herself believe, just for a moment, that perhaps the future could hold more than the loneliness she'd resigned herself to. When his fingers interlaced with hers, something long dormant stirred in her chest. "I've been alone so long," she whispered. "Not anymore," he promised, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, speaking in hushed tones about small dreams, a garden that would bloom come spring, a porch that needed mending, horses that would need tending at first light. At dawn, they walked the dewy fields together. The Oklahoma prairie stretched before them, bathed in golden light that transformed the humble landscape into something magnificent. Their boots quickly became soaked from the morning moisture, but neither seemed to mind. "Land looks different when you're not facing it alone," John observed, his voice carrying on the gentle breeze. Mary nodded, watching a hawk circle overhead. The burdens she'd carried for so long felt lighter somehow, shared between them like the comfortable silence. "I used to think this place was my punishment," she confessed. "Now I'm not so sure." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "This land ain't punishment or blessing on its own. It's just land. We decide what we make of it." As they turned back toward the cabin, their footprints left parallel tracks in the dew-covered grass, no longer a single path, but two side by side. The morning dew clung to the tall grass as John Smith and Mary walked the perimeter of her property. The Oklahoma sun was just beginning to warm the earth, casting long shadows across the prairie. They moved in comfortable silence, their boots leaving parallel tracks in the soft ground. "Look there," John said, his voice gentle as he pointed to a small cluster of purple wildflowers pushing through the cracked soil. The drought had been merciless for weeks, turning much of the land brittle and brown. Yet somehow, these delicate blooms had found their way to the light. Mary knelt beside them, her rough fingers hovering just above the vibrant petals. "How do they survive when everything else withers?" she wondered aloud. The cowboy crouched beside her, his weathered hat casting a shadow across his face. "They grow even in drought, like you," he said quietly. Mary felt her chest tighten at his words. For years she had seen herself as barren in every sense, unable to bear children, unable to nurture life of any kind. Yet here was this man who looked at her and saw strength instead of failure. "I'm not like these flowers, John," she whispered, her voice catching. "They create beauty. I've only known how to survive." He shook his head, the morning light catching in his eyes. "Surviving is its own kind of blooming, Mary. Look at how far you've come on this land, all by yourself." She wanted to tell him everything then, about the doctor in town who had confirmed what she'd long suspected about her inability to have children, about the husband who had abandoned her because of it, about the nights she'd cried herself to sleep in the empty cabin. The words rose to her lips but caught there, trapped by years of practiced silence. Instead, Mary squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own. In that silent moment beneath the vast Oklahoma sky, she felt truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. John picked one of the wildflowers and tucked it gently behind her ear. "Some things don't need explaining," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Some things just are." They continued their walk, the homestead coming back into view as they crested a small rise. The wooden cabin no longer looked quite so lonely to Mary. With John beside her, the weathered structure seemed less like a place of isolation and more like a beginning. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the invitation. His smile was slow and warm. "I'd like that very much." The cabin that had once been Mary Johnson's lonely refuge now echoed with conversation and warmth. Evenings that had stretched endlessly before now passed in comfortable companionship as she and John shared stories by lamplight. The walls that had witnessed her silent tears now absorbed their laughter, creating a home from what had been merely shelter. "Tell me about your first horse," Mary asked one evening as they sat on the worn wooden floor, backs against the bed frame. The lantern cast dancing shadows across their faces. John Smith smiled, his weathered features softening with memory. "Old Thunder, meanest Mustang this side of the Mississippi, but loyal to a fault." His fingers absently traced patterns on her palm as he spoke, each touch a silent reassurance. Mary found herself leaning into him, the warmth of his shoulder against hers now familiar and necessary. The silence between their words had transformed from the hollow emptiness she once knew into something rich and comfortable, like the pause between notes in a well-loved melody. Outside, the Oklahoma wind whistled through the prairie grass. But inside, time seemed suspended. John's guitar rested in the corner, silent now, but promising music for tomorrow. The cowboy had brought melody back into her life, note by note, day by day. "Your turn," he prompted, his voice low and gentle in the dim light. "What did you dream of before you came west?" Mary hesitated, her throat tightening. Dreams had been dangerous things, leading only to disappointment. Yet in his presence, she found the courage to remember. "A family," she whispered, the admission still painful despite their growing closeness. "Children running through wildflowers, laughter around a table." Her voice faltered. "Things I can't give you." The fear that had been building inside her finally spilled out. "What if I can't give you enough?" she asked, her words barely audible above the crackling fire. "What if this," she gestured between them, "isn't enough without children?" John turned to face her fully, the lantern light catching in his eyes. His calloused hands, hands that could break a wild horse yet tend a wounded bird, gently cupped her face. The tenderness in his touch nearly undid her. "You're enough, Mary, always." His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Family isn't just what we're born to or what we birth. It's what we build together, day by day. In that moment, beneath the roof they'd repaired together, surrounded by the simple possessions that now told their shared story, Mary felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the knot that had bound her heart for so long. Mary Johnson felt the warm tracks of tears on her cheeks as years of accumulated grief finally found release. Each tear carried away fragments of her pain, the shame of her infertility, the crushing weight of isolation, the belief that she was somehow less than whole. For the first time, in as long as she could remember, her chest felt expansive, her breath coming easier, as if a great stone had been lifted. "You're lighter," John observed one morning, his weathered hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Like you've set something down." She nodded, unable to articulate the transformation happening within her. The cabin, that had once felt like a prison, now hummed with possibility. When Samuel Parker, their nearest neighbor, whose homestead lay 3 miles east, rode up one afternoon with news of a dance in town, Mary's first instinct was to decline. Social gatherings had long been sources of pain. Watching other women with their children, fielding pitying glances and intrusive questions. "I don't think I should," she began, but stopped when she caught John's expression. His eyes crinkled at the corners, a slow smile spreading across his sun-browned face. "Might do us good," he said, his voice carrying no pressure, only invitation. Mary hesitated. "I haven't danced in years." "Neither have I," John admitted with a chuckle. "Reckon we'll look foolish together." Something about his easy acceptance of imperfection loosened the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "All right," she found herself saying. "I'll go." The evening of the dance arrived, with Mary wearing her one good dress, freshly pressed. John had polished his boots and combed his hair, looking so handsome it made her heart flutter like a startled bird. The town hall blazed with the warm glow of dozens of lanterns. Fiddle music spilled into the night air, along with laughter and the rhythmic stomp of boots on wooden floors. Mary froze at the threshold, overwhelmed by the crush of people and noise. John's hand found the small of her back, steady and reassuring. "We can leave any time," he murmured. But then the music changed to something slower, sweeter. John Smith extended his hand, his expression a mixture of hope and tenderness that melted her resistance. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally, a playful glint in his eyes. Mary placed her trembling fingers in his calloused palm, As he led her onto the floor, she stumbled slightly, her feet remembering old patterns imperfectly. "Just follow me," he whispered, drawing her closer. His arm encircled her waist, strong and secure. And she did follow, her body gradually relaxing into the rhythm, her heart pounding not with anxiety, but with unexpected joy. In that moment, surrounded by music and movement, Mary felt herself truly beginning to heal. The night sky stretched endlessly above them as Mary Johnson and John Smith made their way back from the town dance. Stars winked like distant promises as their horses ambled along the familiar path toward home. Mary leaned against John's shoulder, the steady rhythm of his breathing more comforting than any words could be. The weight of years spent alone seemed to lift with each passing moment in his company. "Look there," John whispered, pointing to a shooting star that blazed briefly across the heavens. "Make a wish." Mary closed her eyes, but found she didn't need to wish for anything anymore. What she had once desperately yearned for was already here, solid and real beside her. The cowboy's arm tightened around her waist, and she felt truly cherished for the first time in memory. As their cabin came into view, silhouetted against the moonlit prairie, Mary's heart swelled. The weathered structure that had once felt like a prison of sorrow and regret now beckoned like a sanctuary. They dismounted in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized after weeks of working side by side. John tended to the horses while Mary gathered her skirts, suddenly shy despite the intimacy they'd already shared. "Beautiful night," he said, his voice low and gentle as they stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked beneath their boots, a sound that had once emphasized her solitude, but now felt like a welcome home. Inside, John struck a match and lit a single candle. Golden light spilled across the humble room, transforming the simple furniture into something almost magical. Mary stood in the doorway, watching as he moved with purpose, stoking the dying embers in the fireplace until warmth began to return to the cabin. When he turned to her, his eyes reflected the flickering flame, full of questions and certainty all at once. "Stay with me tonight," he said quietly, the words hanging between them like a prayer. Mary nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. He crossed to her in 2 strides, taking her work-roughened hands in his. Their fingers intertwined, a perfect fit despite all their imperfections. In his arms, beneath the warm sheets, Mary finally released the pain she'd carried for so long. Her barrenness, once a mark of shame, seemed to dissolve in the tenderness of his touch. John whispered words of adoration against her skin, each one healing another crack in her fractured heart. "You're a blessing, Mary," he murmured as she trembled against him. "You always have been." For the first time, she let herself believe it. Dawn painted the Oklahoma sky in hues of amber and gold as Mary Johnson stirred awake, nestled in the protective embrace of John's arms. Their bodies, warm beneath the sheets that had witnessed their union, fit together as if crafted for one another. She traced the weathered lines of his face with gentle fingertips, marveling at how this man had transformed her existence from desolation to abundance. "Morning," he whispered, his voice still thick with sleep. The cowboy pulled her closer, planting a tender kiss on her forehead. "Sleep well?" Mary nodded, her heart full. "Better than I have in years." The cabin that had once echoed with her solitary footsteps now resonated with shared laughter and whispered promises. Together, they established routines that gave rhythm to their days, John tending the horses at dawn while Mary prepared breakfast, their hands meeting over coffee in dented tin mugs before tackling the day's work side by side. They planted a small garden behind the wooden structure, coaxing life from the stubborn Oklahoma soil. Mary found profound joy in nurturing seedlings, watching them push through the earth toward sunlight. Each sprout felt like a victory over the barrenness she had carried within herself for so long. "These tomatoes are thriving," John observed one afternoon, his hat pushed back as he surveyed their handiwork. "Got your touch, I reckon." Mary smiled, dirt smudging her cheeks. "Perhaps I wasn't meant to mother children, but I can still create life." He took her rough hands in his. "You mother everything around you, the land, the animals, even me." His eyes held no judgment, only understanding. "You've brought this place back from the dead." On cool evenings, they sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance across the prairie. John would strum his guitar, filling the vast emptiness with melodies that spoke of resilience and hope. Sometimes neighbors would visit, bringing preserves or fresh bread, no longer seeing the lonely woman, but part of a pair that belonged. Winter nights found them huddled beneath blankets, telling stories by lantern light. Spring brought wildflowers that Mary gathered to brighten their home. Summer days stretched long, with shared labor and stolen kisses beneath the shade of the barn. Fall harvests became celebrations of their joint efforts. What had begun as a chance encounter between two wounded souls had blossomed into a love that defied expectation. Mary no longer defined herself by what she couldn't give, but by what she created each day alongside the man who had seen value in her when she couldn't see it herself. Between John's sheets and within his heart, Mary had found not just pleasure, but purpose. Their love, forged in hardship and nurtured through understanding, became legendary across the wind-swept prairie, a testament to healing that could bloom even in the most barren places.